Ever thought about being afraid of being afraid?
Yeah,
It's quite a fascinating twist on anxiety, isn't it?
it really is.
And today we're diving deep into your sources on phobophobia to unpack exactly what that means.
Hmm.
So this is a focused exploration of phobophobia, what it is at its core, how it kind of intertwines with other anxiety experiences, and importantly, the strategies that can help.
Yeah, and we've got some really good material to work from.
We do. We've got a stack of academic articles and books that have explored the definition, the underlying causes, the symptoms, and crucially, the treatment of phobophobia.
Right.
Our goal here is really to give you a clear handle on this topic, cut through any potential confusion, and just highlight what you absolutely need to know.
It is a bit of a mind bender when you first hear about it, isn't it? The fear of fear itself.
Totally.
And what's interesting is that this isn't just some like philosophical idea, it actually manifests as real anxiety. People worry about the physical sensations that might come with any phobia, and then there's this fear of the phobia that might, take hold.
Right.
It can even show up as a fear of just developing a phobia in the first place.
Wow, okay.
But the consistent thread in the research is pretty clear. Phobophobia sits firmly within the landscape of anxiety disorders.
Right. So it's not just floating out there on its own. It sounds like it's deeply connected to things like panic attacks and other specific phobias,
Mhm.
maybe especially something like agoraphobia.
Absolutely. That connection is strong. You could almost see phobophobia as the thing that ramps up the intensity.
Yeah.
If you're already anxious or maybe prone to panic, if the fear of that feeling itself becoming overwhelming, becoming a phobia, can really amplify the whole problem.
That makes sense.
And what's particularly striking and mentioned in the sources is that even if phobophobia didn't start a particular phobia,
Uh-huh.
it can definitely fuel it. It can keep it going strong.
So it's like pouring gasoline on an existing fire.
Exactly. And here's a key difference the sources point out compared to many other phobias. Often there isn't an external trigger, something in the environment that sets off phobophobia.
Okay, so what is the trigger then?
Well, the trigger is often internal. It's those really unsettling physical sensations
Right.
that can feel so much like the start of a panic attack.
So it's like your body's own anxiety response becomes the thing you're afraid of.
Precisely. That initial anxious feeling becomes a signal, almost a conditioned cue, that more anxiety is on its way.
Wow, a real downward spiral then.
It can be, yeah. And it's a fear that can be present even before you're actually confronted with the thing you're phobic about. It's the dread of the experience of fear itself.
That anticipatory dread.
That's it. The research often points to generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD, as a kind of precursor to phobophobia.
Ah, okay.
And phobophobia itself can even contribute to having more panic attacks.
And I suppose like with other phobias, people start avoiding things.
Definitely. Avoidance becomes a key strategy. People might start avoiding situations, places, sometimes even tuning out their own internal feelings, all in an effort to escape that core fear.
Okay, so how does this fear of fear actually take hold? What's the starting point, according to the sources?
Well, the sources suggest there are often these underlying predispositions, maybe rooted partly in the unconscious mind.
Hmm.
And there's a notable connection to past emotionally charged experiences, specifically ones involving phobias.
Huh.
Interestingly, the process of forgetting an initial traumatic event and then later recalling the emotional impact can play a role.
That's fascinating. So the memory of the feeling remains even if the event details fade.
Kind of, yeah. Also, someone already struggling with a specific phobia, say heights or spiders,
Right.
they can develop a fear of that phobia itself because the anxiety and panic associated with it were just so intense.
So it's like fearing the phobia will escalate or become unbearable.
Exactly. That's a big part of it. Fearing it'll just get worse and worse.
That makes a lot of sense. If you've had a truly terrifying experience with a phobia, the idea of it recurring or intensifying would be frightening in itself.
Absolutely. And it's highlighted quite clearly that untreated anxiety disorders, just in general, can significantly increase someone's susceptibility, make them more vulnerable to developing phobophobia and other phobias too.
So addressing underlying anxiety is key.
It seems so. Beyond these personal experiences, the sources also mention broader factors that might be at play.
Like what?
Well, think way back. Evolutionary history, what we call phylogenetic influence.
Okay.
The idea that maybe we're inherently more prone to fearing certain things. Then there's our individual genetic makeup, age, sex differences sometimes, and even biochemical factors within the body can contribute.
So it's potentially a mix of our personal history, maybe some biology, and perhaps some deeply ingrained tendencies that can set the stage for phobophobia.
That seems to be the picture painted by the sources. Yes, a combination of factors.
Now, what does phobophobia actually feel like day to day? What are the key symptoms someone might experience?
Well, the symptoms of phobophobia often look a lot like those we see in panic attacks and generalized anxiety disorder. They overlap quite a bit.
Okay.
So we're talking about things like dizziness, a racing or pounding heart, maybe excessive sweating,
Mm-hmm.
that pins and needles sensation, which is called paresthesia. Muscle tension is common too, rapid breathing or hyperventilation,
Right.
a general feeling of intense anxiety or, angst, even feeling faint.
And the avoidance we talked about.
Yes, absolutely. And as we discussed, avoidance of potential triggers, whether they're internal feelings or external situations, that's a really significant behavioral symptom.
It sounds incredibly disruptive, just like your whole
Yes.
system is constantly on high alert.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. As we were saying about that cycle of anxiety, people with phobophobia often become hyper-aware, hypersensitive even, to the physical and emotional signals of fear. This heightened sensitivity, it might be triggered by a past traumatic event, or maybe even just by observing someone else's intense anxiety, a learned response.
Right.
And it's particularly common, the sources note, in individuals who already have anxiety disorders. They're often more attuned to their body's reactions anyway.
So a slight increase in heart rate, for instance, might immediately be interpreted as, oh no, here it comes.
Exactly. That immediate jump to the worst conclusion.
And I imagine that our thoughts really amplify those physical sensations.
Oh, absolutely. Cognitive distortions, those patterns of thinking that aren't quite accurate, and they play a huge role. Things like imagining the absolute worst case scenario.
Catastrophizing.
That's the one. And applying one negative experience to all similar situations.
Overgeneralization.
Right. Those are often central to maintaining the grip of phobophobia.
Now, you mentioned earlier that generalized anxiety disorder often precedes phobophobia. Could we explore that connection a bit more?
Sure. Generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD, is generally characterized by this persistent state of worry, often about uncertain events, or just feeling threatened even when there's no clear danger present.
Okay.
It really crosses the line into being a disorder when this constant worrying becomes so frequent and intense that it starts to interfere with daily life, with functioning.
Got it.
And the research consistently shows that GAD often creates the environment, the sort of fertile ground, in which phobophobia can then develop.
Okay.
That constant state of underlying worry seems to prime the mind to latch onto the experience of fear itself as a new, specific threat.
So it's like that underlying kind of unfocused anxiety can then crystallize or narrow down into this specific fear of fear itself.
Precisely. That's a good way to think about it. Some of the common symptoms you see with GAD include things like pale skin, sweating, maybe dilated pupils, a rapid heartbeat, sometimes elevated blood pressure, muscle tension, trembling, being easily startled.
Yeah, the jumpiness.
Exactly. Maybe a dry mouth and throat, rapid breathing, sometimes a feeling of desperation or that sinking sensation in the stomach, and often a strong urge to just escape or hide. A core aspect is often not really knowing the specific cause of the worry, which itself can fuel that feeling of being out of control.
It sounds incredibly taxing just to live with that constant undercurrent of anxiety.
It really is. And the sources explain that this generalized anxiety can often become a disorder when maybe past psychological trauma creates a lingering sense of fear about potential future dangers, even vague ones.
Okay.
So you have this initial anxiety, often without a clear trigger, which can then potentially lead to panic attacks.
Right.
And it's within this context, this heightened anxiety, potential panic, that phobophobia can emerge.
It's like a pathway.
Kind of. If these underlying anxiety disorders aren't addressed, the prolonged experience of these feelings can leave someone much more vulnerable, more susceptible to developing both phobophobia and other specific phobias. The sources also highlight that general anxiety, partly because it's less tied to specific events or learned drives, might make it easier for these more focused fears, like phobophobia, to actually take hold.
That really clarifies the potential progression there. Now, what about the relationship between phobophobia and panic attacks? That also seemed like a really significant link.
Yes, definitely. During a panic attack, there's often this overwhelming feeling of impending doom, a real conviction that you're about to die or experience some terrible catastrophe,
Yeah.
which triggers a strong fight or flight response, wanting to flee or scream.
Okay.
Now, when phobophobia is present, a panic attack can be experienced as the fear that the calamities associated with the feared phobia are actually happening or are inevitable.
I see.
The specific nature of a panic attack, what the individual fears will happen, is very personal, right?
Right.
And in that way, it mirrors the personal nature of phobophobia, which is all about your specific fears intensifying and taking over.
So let's see if I've got this right. While a panic attack is this intense wave of fear about some imminent disaster, when you have phobophobia, that disaster you fear is specifically the feared phobia actually materializing or its worst consequences happening.
Exactly. You've got it. Phobophobia is more the psychological fear of the phobia itself, which then intensifies the experience.
Okay.
Whereas panic attacks are these acute episodes of extreme fear about an imminent disaster. And in the context of phobophobia, that disaster often revolves around those feared phobias coming true.
Gotcha. What are some common panic attack symptoms?
Well, experiencing at least 4 of these is often part of the diagnostic criteria. Things like shortness of breath or dyspnea, palpitations, chest pain or discomfort, a feeling of choking or smothering, dizziness, vertigo, unsteady feelings, maybe feelings of unreality.
Derealization.
Right. Paresthesias, again, those tingling sensations. Hot or cold flushes, faintness, trembling or shaking, sweating, just difficulty breathing in general.
That's a lot.
It is. And there can also be noticeable disturbances in heart action alongside those feelings of intense desperation and angst we mentioned.
That sounds incredibly frightening. And I noticed in the sources that the ways you treat phobophobia and panic attacks seem to have a lot of overlap. Is that right?
That's correct. Because individuals with phobophobia often present with these intense, seemingly irrational fears, much like those with more, say, conventional phobias. The therapeutic approaches used for panic disorders are often very effective for phobophobia, too. Exposure-based techniques are really fundamental in treating phobias generally,
Right.
especially the fear itself. And in the case of phobophobia, this includes exposure to the feared phobias and those internal bodily sensations that trigger the anxiety.
Okay, so exposure is key. And the sources mention some specific exposure techniques, like paradoxical intention. Can you explain how that works?
Yeah, paradoxical intention. It's described as particularly helpful in addressing the fear of phobophobia itself, the specific phobia someone dreads, and even certain anxiety-related physical sensations.
How does it work?
The core idea is to intentionally, paradoxically, expose the person to the very thing they are avoiding because it provokes fear.
Okay.
So, by deliberately encountering these feared sensations, or even imagining the feared phobia, but in a safe and controlled therapeutic setting, the therapist can guide the individual to realize that there's no actual danger present. The feared catastrophe doesn't happen. And that ultimately helps to diminish the fear response over time.
So it's like confronting your anxieties head on, but with expert guidance and support, learning they aren't truly dangerous.
Exactly. It takes courage, but it can be very effective.
What about the technique of artificially producing symptoms? That sounded quite direct.
Yes, symptoms artificially produced, or often called interoceptive exposure. It's primarily aimed at tackling the fear of those internal bodily sensations that come up during phobophobia.
Right, the dizziness, the heart pounding.
Precisely. This involves using substances like, say, caffeine, or sometimes a carefully controlled mixture of carbon dioxide and oxygen, or even adrenaline, under very careful medical supervision, of course. The aim is to intentionally trigger those physical symptoms that mimic anxiety, like hyperventilation, pounding heart, maybe blurred vision, tingling.
Okay, but why?
The goal is to help patients learn that these sensations, while uncomfortable, are not inherently dangerous, and crucially, to develop a sense of control over them.
Ah, I see.
Now, initially, this might indeed trigger some panic, that's expected. But as research, like the study by Dr. Gries and Vandenhout mentioned in the sources, has shown, with repeated controlled exposure, patients typically experience a significant reduction in their fear. Fear of the bodily sensations, fear of panic attacks, and even fear of the original feared phobia itself. They learn these feelings don't necessarily lead to catastrophe.
So by safely and intentionally bringing on these feelings, they learn they can cope with them, ride them out, and that they aren't signs of something terrible actually happening. That's a really interesting approach.
It is. It directly targets that fear of the internal sensations.
And cognitive modification was also highlighted. How does that fit in?
Cognitive modification, or cognitive restructuring, is crucial. It focuses on addressing and correcting the inaccurate information and those often catastrophic beliefs that fuel phobophobia.
Okay.
Therapists work to help patients understand that their anxiety symptoms don't actually signify impending danger or a total loss of control, even though it feels that way.
Right. Challenging those scary thoughts.
Exactly. Many experts believe this cognitive piece is vital for successful treatment, especially when it's combined with something like interoceptive exposure.
How they work together.
Well, the exposure demonstrates that no actual calamity occurs during these physical sensations.
Right, the proof.
And the cognitive work helps foster a sense of self-control and reinforces the realization that the fears are not based in reality. It also involves challenging other deep-seated misconceptions people might have,
Like what?
like the fear of going crazy or needing to be institutionalized or completely losing control. These are common fears associated with intense anxiety.
Yeah.
But it's important to acknowledge the sources note that identifying and realistically challenging these deeply ingrained beliefs can be a difficult process for many patients.
Yeah.
But it's essential work.
It makes perfect sense that you'd need to address those underlying thought patterns for any lasting change. And lastly, relaxation and breathing control techniques were mentioned. How do they help?
Right. Relaxation and breathing control. These techniques provide individuals with practical tools to both sometimes induce and then manage the somatic sensations they fear in phobophobia.
Okay.
So hyperventilation, for instance. It's a common anxiety symptom that leads to dizziness, faintness, and so on.
Hmm.
In therapy, someone might be guided to intentionally hyperventilate slightly, just enough to trigger those sensations in a controlled way.
Okay.
And then they're taught specific relaxation exercises and controlled breathing techniques to counteract those effects, to bring things back down.
Ah, so they learn they can influence these feelings.
Exactly. It helps them regain a sense of mastery over their body's responses to anxiety. This can significantly reduce the impact of phobophobia, especially when it's used alongside the other therapeutic methods we've discussed.
So it's about learning to regulate the body's physical reactions to fear, building that self-efficacy.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, let's shift gears just slightly. Let's talk about the term itself, phobophobia. It has Greek roots, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. The term phobophobia is an English adaptation derived directly from the Greek word phobos, which simply means fear.
So the literal translation is just fear of fear.
Indeed, fear of fear. It's also interesting to consider its close relationship to the concept of anxiety sensitivity.
Which is?
Anxiety sensitivity is basically the extent to which individuals are afraid of anxiety-related symptoms themselves, believing they have harmful consequences. Very related concept.
Okay.
And the sources even point to that powerful line from Franklin D. Roosevelt's first inaugural address.
Yeah.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. A pretty striking historical articulation of this very concept, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. That's a really resonant quote and captures the essence of phobophobia perfectly.
Yeah.
So for you, the listener, as we kind of bring this all together, what are the key things to take away from our discussion today?
I think the most crucial takeaways are, first, that phobophobia is a genuine and, importantly, treatable condition.
Right.
Second, it's intricately linked with other anxiety disorders, especially generalized anxiety disorder and panic attacks. Understanding that connection is helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Third, there are effective treatment options available, particularly those involving exposure-based techniques and cognitive modification that we talked about.
Right.
And finally, I think understanding that self-perpetuating cycle of fear, how fearing the fear keeps it going, that understanding is a vital step towards managing and ultimately overcoming it.
Excellent summary. So we've taken a pretty comprehensive deep dive into phobophobia today, exploring its definition, its connections to broader anxiety experiences, and the diverse and thankfully effective ways it can be addressed.
Yeah, and we've highlighted those main treatment strategies from, directly facing feared situations and sensations to retraining our thoughts about them and learning to manage our body's responses through relaxation and breathing.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you to consider. Given this complex interplay we've discussed between our thoughts, our emotions, and our physical sensations, how might a deeper understanding of this specific fear of fear provide broader insights into how we might navigate and manage other forms of anxiety in our own lives?